Well, we're continuing on. We're in this series called The Christian Atheist. And we said that the tagline here is examining how we often believe in God, but live like He doesn't exist. So in all practical purposes, we're like Christian atheists. Yeah, we believe in God, we've accepted Him into our lives, but we live sometimes like He doesn't exist. So today, we're going to start with a quiz. We'll see how good you guys are at finishing these sentences, okay? I'm not perfect, just forgiven. There you go. Very good. You're going to see a theme very quickly here. To err is human, to forgive divine. That is correct. All right. How about this one? It's easier to ask forgiveness than get permission. That's right. That's how you can live your life, actually. Forgive and forget. Everybody knows. How about this one? Forgiveness is the blank of relationships. This is a little more obscure. It's the oil of relationships. It's easier to forgive an blank than to forgive a blank. It's easier to forgive an enemy than to forgive a friend. You know, forgiveness, it's kind of the basis of our faith, isn't it? Isn't it kind of the base of everything we believe? It's if we claim to be a follower of Jesus, it's the core of who we are. It's the heart of everything we do. We talk about it. It's encouraged. It's given a lot of airtime in churches. And yet it is often misunderstood or unpracticed. They asked some kids, they were teaching a lesson on forgiveness, and at the end the teacher said, all right, we're doing a review. So what needs to happen in order to obtain forgiveness? And a young man said, you got to sin first. Okay? Another child, when they were younger, they said, I used to think that I had to pray to God to get a bicycle. And then I realized prayer doesn't work that way. So instead, I stole a bicycle and prayed for forgiveness. Yeah, I don't know if that really happened. But it does demonstrate there's these weird views of forgiveness. And in the world around us, forgiveness is seen as weakness. It's designed for wimpy people. Real men get even, right? And some things are just too egregious to forgive. One of our previous presidents said this: forgive your enemies, but never forget their names. I thought, well, that's an interesting view of forgiveness, isn't it? I'm forgiving you, but I got my eye on you, right? Not really. And about the only time you'll hear forgiveness encouraged in society today is when you're forgiving who? Yourself. Oh, you got to forgive yourself. Oh, you got to be good to yourself. You got to forgive yourself. Forgiving others, that's not. And as followers of Jesus, we like the idea of forgiveness, but C.S. Lewis said this. I think it's a fantastic quote. He says, everyone says that forgiveness is a lovely idea until he has something to forgive. And it's very easy to live as Christian atheists when it comes to forgiveness. We've accepted Christ's forgiveness, and we know we're supposed to forgive. We know we're supposed to do it, most of the time, all the time. But we have a couple of problems. So here's a couple of the problems that we have when it comes to forgiveness. Here's the first. We feel at some level like there has to be exceptions. We never say that, but there's all these reasons to be bitter and angry, and most of us remember things that have hurt us very, very deeply in life. And so we feel like the forgiveness is the best course of action, but there are just some things that are like, I don't know. And they tend to be those big things like sexual abuse in our past. Or, you know what? I had a close friend and they gossiped about me. They ruined my reputation. I wonder if that's out of bounds. Or you were cheated out of money. It actually changed how you lived your life because of what someone did to you. Or your spouse lived a secret life that you found out and it crushed you. Maybe your parents did something that deeply disappointed you. I don't know. Maybe you're just trampled by someone you loved or trusted, or your friend set fire to your rookie baseball card. I don't know what it is, right? But there's something in us that says, there's just some things that you don't understand. This is not forgivable. Sometimes it's people who are unforgivable. Hey, I can forgive anybody, not them. They tend to be family members. Yeah, I can forgive anybody, but not my mom, not my dad. not my brother or my sister. They don't deserve to be forgiven because what they did was over the top. It was way outside, and I can't deal with it. Now, that's the first problem, is we think there's exceptions. The second problem we think is that we don't even know what it looks like. Because we've been told to forgive, but there's misconceptions about forgiveness. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same playing field as we look at this morning. So there's some misconceptions that we've heard about forgiveness, and you may know this, but I thought it'd be a good reminder. Because, first of all, we've had these exceptions, but then we have these misconceptions. Here's the first. Forgiveness is not an emotion. One of the reasons that the world thinks forgiveness is weak is because we tie it to this sugary, sweet kind of feeling, and we think, well, I don't want to do that. I never feel that. I don't even want to feel that way. We think we have to feel warm and fuzzy in order to forgive. And that once we do, we'll have these nice, relaxing feelings about people. Just simply not true. Because I think, I'm going to forgive, but I don't really have very positive feelings, Well, that doesn't work. And it means I have to generate these positive emotions, and since I still feel hurt and bitterness, that means I obviously haven't forgiven. We have to move away from this idea that forgiveness is an emotion. Second, it doesn't just happen. You know that we don't morph our way into forgiveness. You know that saying, time heals all wounds, one of the most untruthful statements ever uttered in the history of humanity. Time does not heal wounds. Time plus intentional effort can heal wounds. So this idea that forgiveness just happens, if I just kind of let it go, it does not get better. And the reason I know this is because there's a bunch of you in here today that when I said something about forgiveness, there was a name and a person that popped into your head, and for some of you, it's from 20 to 30 years ago. It's right there on the surface of your mind. It doesn't just go away. If I just say, I'm not going to do anything, I'm just going to wait for my heart to change and for God to do something, you'll be waiting a long time. And here's the third. It's not dismissing or ignoring. This one happens a lot, I think, in Christian circles. We say, I've forgiven them. But what we really mean is, I've decided they're not important enough to waste my time on. And so I'm going to ignore them and or the event that I need to forgive. That is very different from forgiving. Because that's basically saying, you know what, I'm still hurt, I'm still bitter deep down, it's buried down here, I'm just going to refuse to think about it anymore. That is running away, not forgiveness. So anytime we buy into these lies, these misconceptions, we get ourselves into trouble. So you're probably in one of several different places this morning. And that's why we're going to try and tackle this from a parable that Jesus told. You might be in a place where you're like, there's a person, there's a thing, there's something that happened that I just cannot forgive. I can't. It's too big. It's too hurtful. Well, I hope you'll be challenged this morning. Or maybe you're in a place where you're like, I am trying to forgive, but man, I'm finding this tough. I cannot get away from this. I'm working on it, but it does not seem to be happening. Well, then I hope you'll find something encouraging or helpful. And maybe you say, I'm good. I got no one that I need to forgive. Well, then I hope you will be prepared for the next time you're hurt. Or perhaps you'll stop lying to yourself that there is nobody. I don't know. It'll apply to every single person this morning. So let's take a look at it. Because here's the main idea that I want you to walk away from this morning. It's simply this. Forgiveness, the reason that God did this is a living picture of Jesus in us. We used to do this game when I was in children's ministry, and we called it Telling a Story with Living Pictures. Have you ever done this? Right? And so you would tell the story, and then you would arrange the kids in all these weird positions, and you get them, and you'd say, okay, now you have to freeze, because this is a living picture of what we're trying to tell. That's what forgiveness is. Forgiveness says this is a living picture of Jesus in us. So Jesus talked about this a lot, and we're going to look at a parable. It's in Matthew 18 if you want to follow along. Of course, I'll put it up on the screen, but if you want to bring it up on your app or your ARAC app or any other one, we're going to follow along. Starting at verse 21 in Matthew chapter 18. And it starts out like this. Peter came to Jesus, and he asked, Lord, how many times should I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times? We're going to talk about this in a second, but I think Peter was pretty proud of himself for this question. And Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, 77 times. And I'm sure that if we understood what was going on, right where that period is, there were some reactions in Peter and the people around him that went, what? He says, let me tell you a story. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And as he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 talents, which is like millions of dollars, so much money, was brought to him. And since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. The servant fell on his knees before him. "Be patient with me," he begged. "I will pay back everything," which is crazy because there was no way he was ever going to be able to pay this back. The servant's master took pity on him. He canceled the debt. He let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, a few $100s. He grabbed him. He began to choke him. "Pay back what you owe me," he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees. He begged him, "Be patient with me, and I will pay you back." And in this case, he probably could have. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt, which I never understood as a child. How are you going to pay off a debt if you're in prison? Right? Wouldn't you say he got him a job? But that's not what he did, right? You're going to prison. We're going to figure a way to start. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed. They went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said. "I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" In anger, his master turned him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you, unless you forgive your brother from your heart. Marvelous story of forgiveness. So here's what I want to do. I want to look at a couple pieces. First is this. I want to look at how God views forgiveness, because we're not going to get this unless we understand how God sees it. And this story, because in every parable that Jesus tells like this, there's always a figure in the story that represents God. That's how he tells the story. He's trying to show how people interact with him. And so obviously that's the master in this story. So here's a couple things on how God sees this. Forgiveness is not an if command. There are many commands that we hear that say, if this happens, then do this. If you're an engineer, you know these if, then, else statements, right? If this happens, then do this. Otherwise, you do this. That's not forgiveness. There's no if involved in this. It's never, well, I want you to forgive them if. That never exists. And it's funny because if we think there are exceptions to whether they should be forgiven, then we have not fully understood forgiveness. So Peter, he comes to Jesus. "Lord, how many times should I forgive my brother against me?" And you have to understand what the rabbis would teach to get this question. Because in the day, rabbis would often teach if someone sins against you, you can forgive them up to 3 times, and on the 4th time, you can wipe your hands of it. So Peter's coming saying, "Hey, God, Jesus, what do you think? 7 times?" He's probably thinking, that's amazing. Now, I want you to consider, in order to forgive someone 7 times, they have to hurt you 7 times. That's a lot. Most of us, by the 2nd or 3rd time, are like, I don't want anything to do with this person. So Peter's like, look, if someone does this 7 times, and Jesus' answer was just out of the blue startling. Hey, I want you to do it 77 times. And Jesus' point was never to put a number on it, right? You know that. He said, there is no end to this. There is no finish line. There is no point at which this stops. There is no place where you are off the hook for forgiveness. Because forgiveness is only necessary because someone hurt you. Right? You don't have to forgive something if it didn't hurt you. Every time we need to forgive, it's because someone did something that actually hurt us, which leads to bitterness. And bitterness eventually leads to hatred, because that's just how it works. And we feel like we're justified. Well, you know what? I've been wronged. I have the right to feel this way. And Jesus says, no, you don't have that right. This is not an option. By the way, if you're not a follower of Jesus, this is totally optional. You don't have to do this at all. I would say you should, because there's benefits. But if you're not a Jesus follower, you can ignore all this. But if you claim to be a Jesus follower, there's no wiggle room in here. This is not an if thing. He says you do not actually have the right to be bitter and hurtful and angry and remain there. Well, why? So how do you deal with that? Because Jesus says we have to be prepared to forgive and to never, ever stop. Well, the only way to do that is to come to this very, very key realization, which we know in the church, but I think sometimes we forget. And it's this right here. I forgive because God forgave first, He forgave bigger, and He forgave me. Forgiveness is part of God's character and His nature. It's who He is, not just something He does. And so when we talk about reflecting that, remember we said this is a living picture of Jesus in us. We're reflecting who God is to the world around us. I remember the one and only time I ever played football on a team. It was just touch football because I probably weighed 110 pounds. I was like in the 7th grade, so I would have died. So instead, I just joined a touch football team. And I'll never forget because, it was a bunch of guys, 7th and 8th graders, all trying to be macho men, which 7th and 8th graders can't be, but they try really hard. And I'll never forget because the coach of our team was a coarse, vulgar man. And his jokes and his language and everything else was just that way. And of course, I grew up in a very sheltered environment. This was very wow. But you know what happened? The team began to reflect the character of their coach. And you listen to the guys talk, and they were like, oh, this is cool. And so their language and their attitudes began to reflect the coach. It was just, it wasn't a fond memory. I don't think I played very long. But it's interesting because they took who was their coach and began to reflect him in how they lived. And that's exactly what Jesus is saying. You need to reflect your Savior. The servant fell on his knees. He said, be patient. I'll pay everything back. And the servant's master took pity on him. He forgave him. The master felt his hurt and his pain, and he forgave the debt, even though the debt was self-inflicted by the servant. We serve a God who forgives. You know this. There are passages all over Scripture, but it's interesting in Exodus when God is kind of coming out to Israel and demonstrating and showing himself to the entire nation. It's fascinating what he focuses on. When Moses said, look, I want to see you, God, and he's so passionate about wanting to connect, we read that the Lord passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, and look what he proclaims. This is the thing he wants him to understand about himself. The Lord is compassionate and gracious, God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. In other words, God says, look, you want to know what I'm like? It's interesting, he didn't show him his majesty or his might. He says, I want you to understand, I love you, and I forgive. That's who I am. It's my essence as a God. And so, if that's who God is, and that's how he's treated us, then we have no choice. The master called his servant in after, and he said, look, I canceled the debt of yours. You begged me to do this, and I did because I was compassionate to you. Shouldn't you have done the same thing? Like, what is wrong with you? I did this, and you didn't. The reason that this servant was supposed to forgive his fellow servant was why? Because he'd been forgiven. In fact, he'd been forgiven way more. See, we understand the nature of sin against us, right? And we understand that not all are equal, right? We all know that. Someone gossiping about you is not the same as someone who was sexually abused for 4 years growing up. Those are not equal offenses. And sometimes people do things to you. The person whose family was murdered in the killing fields of Rwanda is not the same as the fact that someone was mean to you, right? There are different levels. But the principle here is this, and we have to grasp this because it doesn't feel this way. There is nothing that can happen to you in this life that will leaving you having to forgive more than God forgave you. Doesn't feel like it. There's literally nothing, and there are horrific stories from around this globe and the people that you know that could happen to you where you have to forgive more than Jesus forgave you. Paul said, look, we were enemies of God, we were completely sinful, we were rebellious, we were anti-God in every part of our nature. And he said, I'm going to die so you can be forgiven. If we don't get that, you will not forgive other people. If you get this, you will forgive other people. But since it doesn't often feel that way, because that's a Bible story, I was God's enemy, but I really wasn't his enemy. I mean, I just was a bad kid or whatever. It doesn't really feel like that was that much. You have no idea. This is what they did to me. Like we have a little bit of difficulty making that connection, so we're only left with this, which is that forgiveness then is a decision. You have to choose to do it. The servant was faced with a choice, right? Forgiving his fellow servant was not dependent on a gushy-mushy feeling. He had to choose. So his fellow servant fell on his knees and begged him. And you notice how Jesus tells the story. He uses the identical language as the first servant did with his master. He had to choose whether or not to let the debt go. And it says, but he refused. He reached a decision point and said, not doing it. I'm going to get my pound of flesh. Our decision to forgive is never, ever, ever, ever based on what they do to deserve it from us. And we don't do it only when we feel like it. In fact, I would say this, we decide to forgive before we ever feel like it, and we may or may not feel like it after. And this, at least in my experience, is never, ever easy. But see, God was not happy with our rebellion. It wasn't something that he was like, it doesn't really matter. It was grievous. It was horrible. But he said, you know what? I'm going to choose to do something about this. I'm not just going to feel something. I'm actually going to choose to do something. So we have to choose to not hold something against them. That means we have to choose intentionally not to harbor bitter feelings or angry thoughts or actions. We have to choose not to dwell on it. We choose to take what they owe us and say, you know what? I'm going to throw it out. They don't owe me anymore. We don't have to. We choose to say, I'm not going to require them to make this right in order for me to forgive. That means forgiveness requires actions. Now, how do you do that? It's not a one-time thing. It's not quick. The deeper the hurt, the longer the time it takes to forgive. That's just a principle. When you've been hurt extraordinarily deeply, it's going to take time to process that. There's a great illustration of someone who was really struggling with this. Like, I want to forgive, but it just keeps coming back over and over and over. And the person who was counseling them said, look, you have to think of this as like ringing a bell, right? Have you ever seen these in the movies or ever done this? Where if you pull on the rope, right, the bell rings, right? And the more you pull, it rings and rings and rings. And he says, forgiveness is just simply letting go of the rope. But what happens when you let go of the rope, if you've been ringing the bell, what continues to happen for a while? The bell keeps ringing. And over time, it begins to slow down, begins to settle, and eventually it stops. And that's this process of forgiveness. It's a great picture because what God is saying is you've got to let go of the rope. And for a while, there are going to be echoes. And you're still going to struggle, and it's still going to wake you up in the middle of the night, and you're still going to get irritated, and you're still going to get angry, and you're still going to have to talk to God about this. But if you choose not to grab the rope again, eventually, the echoes go away. And you're done with it. Well, how do you do that? That sounds all lovely. Let me just give you 2 tips that I think are really helpful. First is this: pray blessing on the person who you're struggling to forgive. Okay? Now, understand what I'm saying here, okay? Don't pray for them like this. God, they hurt me bad. I'm going to forgive them. But if you could do something to them on the side, right? If you could kind of make something happen, right? I understand those prayers. We've all prayed them. But that's not what we're talking about here. When I say, if we want to do this process, if we want to let go of the rope, let go, one of the ways to do that is to say, I'm going to pray blessing. In other words, God, there is literally nothing good I want to have happen to them right now. But I'm going to ask you to bless them. In fact, I'm going to ask you to bless them in the one area that I don't want them to be blessed. Right? It's like someone who hurts us, and you're like, you know what? The way you treated me, I kind of hope your kids treat you poorly. Instead of doing that, say, God, this is what I want. I want their family to flourish. I want them to be happy in their relationships. God, would you bless that? And then do that over and over. And by the way, you're going to do it and not mean any of it. That's okay. God, I'm going to pray this. I don't want this to happen. I'm kind of hoping you can see that, but I'm going to do this because I know I need to do this. Do that. Jesus said, love your enemies and pray for those people. It won't start out deeply felt in your heart, but that's okay. Do it anyway. God, would you work in them? And then say, God, would you help me mean it? Do you know what happens? He does. And then here's the second part. Not only do that, and that part we think, okay, I can get on board with that. That's tough, but I can do that. This one's a little tougher. Demonstrate love to them in what you say and do. Where you actually say, all right, I got to do something. It's very interesting in this. Whoops, that is my bad. we pray blessing, and when we demonstrate love to them in what we do and say, it's what happened in the story. Because what they were required, when the servant fell on his knees, and he said, be patient, I'll pay back everything. What did the master do? He said, okay, I'm not just going to think nice thoughts about you. I'm actually going to cancel the debt. When I see you in the future, you don't owe this anymore. I'm not going to treat you like you owe me. It's gone. It's done. It's finished. The master forgave. He says, you don't owe me anything. So it's not good enough when we say we forgive if it doesn't extend to our life and our words and our actions. Paul said it this way. He said, be kind and compassionate to one another. Absolutely. Forgiving each other. In other words, your kindness and your compassion are tied to your forgiveness. Why? Because Jesus did it to you first. This is really, really hard. I've had these situations where there was someone, and it's even worse if they're in your church family, and they've done something to hurt you, and you think, I have to see them every Sunday that I show up. Okay? That's when you hope you're in a big church. Because you're like, I don't have to talk to them. Right? I'm going to walk down that hallway. They come in there. I'm going to be sitting before they're in, and if they're in two rows in front of me, I'm going to make sure I leave. I mean, this is what we do. And yet, forgiveness, when it's tied to compassion and kindness, says, no, don't do that. You know what? I'm going to suck it up, and I'm going to say, how you doing? I've been praying for you. How are things moving forward? Paul wrote, make sure no one repays wrong for wrong, but be kind to each other. Not because I want you to grovel and apologize, but because I have forgiven you. Now, I'm wagering that none of this is new information. Am I right in that? There's no new information here. But there is something about this that is so extraordinarily important. And Jesus knew that because it's a picture of Jesus in us. And this is how we show the world that we're not the same. But there's another piece to this, and it's simply this. There are consequences to unforgiveness. Honestly, this is the most troubling part of the entire parable to me, because I've heard many, many stories about forgiveness, and I can kind of get on board with a lot of different things. But did you notice the end of the story? The master called his servant, and he says, you wicked servant. I canceled that debt of yours because you begged me to. You should have had mercy on your fellow servant, just the way I did on you. And in his anger, he turned him over to the jailers, not just to sit in jail, but to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed, which, by the way, he could never do. And then, if that isn't difficult enough, he says, this is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you, unless you forgive from your heart. And I think, what? That's terrifying. The master expected that the heart of his servant should be changed by his forgiveness, and it had not. And that's the exact same expectation Jesus has for us. You know, modern studies have actually explored all this. You can actually read about this. It impacts us psychologically and physically. A Johns Hopkins researcher said that when we don't forgive, it compromises our immune system. We get sick more often. And actually, we have more stress. We don't sleep as well. Blood pressure goes up. There are cardiac issues. It leads to depression, and we worry more. That's just from a worldly, physical perspective. But it has much deeper issues. And it is possible. I was reading a story this week. It was a guy named, let's see if I can get this right, a man named Matt Swatzall. This is back in 2006. And he was a worker, EMS, firefighter, and he had gone a 24-hour shift. He'd slept for 30 minutes. And he was driving home to finally get some rest. And he woke up when his car crashed into another. And the car that he crashed into had a mother who was pregnant and a 19-month-old daughter. And the 19-month-old daughter survived, but the mother and the unborn baby died. It was very interesting because the husband of this young lady, whose name was Eric, was a pastor in student ministry. And he was faced with the choice, what do I do? And he wrestled with this. He wasn't actually even allowed to see or talk to the guy in question because while they were going through the court process, he wasn't able to. But he went through all this process, and at the end, he actually went to the sentencing, and he argued for clemency, that the judge would not add more pain to an already painful situation. And he told the man, I would like to have a relationship with you. And instead of being sentenced to jail, the judge actually gave him community service. And this pastor began getting together with him for breakfast on a regular basis. I don't know how you do that with someone who drove their car into your wife. But at the time this article was written, the friendship was 6 or 7 years old. Matt, the guy who had run into the car, had gotten married, had a child of their own, actually born on the birth date of his wife, of this other guy's wife. And he said, I don't know what my life would be like if this man hadn't forgiven me. And it was a long process, and it took a long time, and this young pastor is now married again, hadn't had another child yet. But it literally changed the course of the life of 2 entire families because they chose to do it. And if he hadn't, the consequences of that would have been enormous. This idea of unforgiveness is not just a casual thing. It's not something a follower of Jesus says, you know what, that's really hard. I'm going to kind of let that go. I'm serving Jesus in lots of other places. I'm going to ignore that. It doesn't work that way. When I refuse to forgive, and I'm not talking about a struggle to forgive. There's a difference here, right? A lot of us have struggles. It's like, oh, I'm going to forgive, but I really can't. I'm really struggling with this. God, I'm trying. Will you help me? That's a struggle. What God is talking about here in this parable is a refusal that says, God, I will not. That's too big. I'm out. Can't do it. Basically, Jesus is saying by this, it's not so much a, hey, you refused, I'm going to punish you. What he's really saying is, if you can't forgive, then you don't understand my forgiveness. You didn't get it in the first place. Because if you did, you'd be forgiving them. We kind of gloss over this sometimes, but you know that's when Jesus gave the disciples the Lord's Prayer. Do you remember how it ends? Forgive each other, because just how you forgive is exactly how God's going to forgive you. We don't like that, but he ties them together. You cannot harbor unforgiveness in your heart and have a vibrant, intimate, life-giving relationship with your Heavenly Father. Can't. And you can hide it, you can do lots of things, you can be active in church, you can do different things, but there will always be something that blocks you from God having that relationship with you. And it's not on his end, it's on yours. Forgiveness is this living picture of Jesus in us. It's a direct result of our understanding of what Jesus has done in forgiving us, and it causes us to have to make a choice. Now, I don't know where you're at this morning, but you might be thinking, okay, Weldon, pastor, that's just religious speak. You don't have to go into the real world like us, right? You just go in your house, you come out on Sundays, you don't actually have to deal with the people I have to deal with, you don't understand, you don't know what they did to me. It's unforgivable. In fact, I don't just dislike them, I hate them. I kind of hope they don't get saved. Don't say, you've all thought that. You know how that is, right? You're like, come on, Pastor, you don't really get this. You're just being religious. You know, I can't even have their name come up in my head without my stomach starting to do these churning flip-flops in my, I could never forgive. Well, I got news for you. On your own, you can't make it happen. You just can't do it by yourself. It will remain elusive on your own. But if you're a follower of Jesus, he says, no, I want you to lean into this and do it. Or you might be here, and after having heard all this, you still say, look, I'm good. I don't have anyone to forgive. I'm fine. I heard a story about an old lady. She was 98 years old, and the pastor was asking her, she's like, I'm good. I have no one to forgive. He says, how do you manage that? She says, I outlived them all. Let me ask you a question, though. If that's you this morning, like, there isn't anybody, is there a name that when it comes up, you find yourself getting irritated, angry, or frustrated. Just an immediate negative reaction. Is there anyone when something bad happens, at some secret deep level, you have some feeling of satisfaction? Serves them right. Is there a name that always seems to pop into your mind when the topic of forgiveness comes up? Every single time. Then maybe it's worth revisiting. Forgiveness is a living picture of Jesus in us. It might take time, it'll take effort, but Christ forgave us. Our debt is paid, we owe nothing. So how about we treat others the same way? Let me close with a story. It's one you're all familiar with. In 2006, Charlie Roberts, you guys remember this name? Walked into an Amish schoolhouse and shot a bunch of kids, killed 5, injured some others, and then shot himself. No satisfaction. You couldn't arrest him. You couldn't prosecute him. He wasn't Amish himself, but he was very engaged in the Amish community, and so were his parents. And when it happened, the first thing the father of the shooter said is, we will never be able to look at our Amish friends again. It's wrecked. It's ruined. And so, of course, these funerals were happening for these young ladies. And I don't know if you remember the story, but the mother and father had a private ceremony to bury their son, the one who had committed the murders. And when they showed up, Amish family after Amish family showed up. Not just them, but the victims showed up. And they gathered around, and they loved on these parents. And they forgave them. And it took a long time because there was a lot of things that happened. There was hurts, there was injuries. The mother of the shooter ended up daily helping one of the young ladies who'd been injured and who was doomed to life in a wheelchair, and said, I want to serve. I want to be part of this. I want to be part of your life. It was so significant that you've all heard about it, because there was article after article and story after story of people said, how do you do this? This isn't natural. This is weird. And yet every single person that would read the story, there's something in them that would go, wow. And you know it's different because with all the recent school shootings, how many of those interviews have you heard where the parent says, we need justice, and I'm going to be there when they're sentenced. They deserve this. And the difference is so big. That's because forgiveness is a picture of Jesus. And when you forgive, the people around you say, what are you doing? I could never forgive that. I would never let them off the hook. And Jesus is like, yeah, I know. I get it. But look what you get to demonstrate when you do.